Hello, Dr. Scott Masson here with you discussing the Rings of Power, episode 5. What's the name of this episode? Partings. That is the title of the episode, at least that's the subtitle. Um, but I see no signs of partings in this episode. In fact, the plot has not moved on in any sense of movement. We are still back where we were in the fourth episode. However, what we have been given in this episode is a little bit of background, which may be in keeping with the sort of plot development in Tolkien in general. Before we move forward, we're going to dig down and reveal some new things. And that is what happens in this episode. So there's many things here that are revealed afoot behind the scenes that we had not seen before. So they add, and these things add a little bit of complexity to the plot. And unfortunately, we return to those wretched Harfoots and the figure whom I assume is Gandalf, who manages to drive off some wargs by whacking the ground with his hand, which seems to injure him. And seems a rather odd thing to do. But at any rate, it's the sort of thing that happens in Marvel comics as well. Thor with his hammer, now Gandalf with his hand, creates shock waves that drives these beasts backwards. Okay. Again, at this point, not particularly interesting, but more interesting is the fact that the place at which this giant from outer space fell in the form of a comet has been overseen by 3 white cloaked figures. Very mysterious, not quite sure what they mean or where they come from. A little bit of digging revealed the identity of these characters to be termed the dweller, the ascetic, and the nomad. And further, these are the sorts of things that happen these days, is that sometimes publicists for Amazon come out and add a little bit of further intrigue and detail, part of the marketing plan, no doubt. We're told that the character of the dweller travels far from the east, from the lands of Rhun, R-H-U-N. And there's some thought that perhaps this figure, who rather looks like Eminem, with rather ominous brows and strange white hair, might be Sauron. I think not. And the suggestion is probably that, based on what the publicist has revealed here, that this is one of the Easterlings. Now, the Easterlings are united in their hatred of the West and were followers of Morgoth and also of Sauron. So perhaps they have come, like many have, to find signs of what is going on. And I think that that's what's happening here. I do not think the big reveal of Sauron has yet happened, and I do not think any of the figures that we have encountered is Sauron, for that matter, either. I think that would diminish the suspense of the plot, and it just makes no sense on the basis of what we've seen. So we have something like devotees or priests, perhaps of Sauron. The dweller looks like she has a staff with some sort of symbol that looks an awful lot like the eye of Sauron, to my mind, at any rate. So that was interesting. These white coated cultists of sorts. And furthermore, on the back of her plate, the ascetic has something that looks a bit like Gandalf's rune, which he wrote into the ground. At least that's what some have speculated. I'm not convinced by that, but if that is the case, then this figure that has fallen to the ground may well be, may not be Gandalf, but rather Sauron. I think that is highly improbable myself. But nonetheless, we shall soon find out. Of greater interest to me at this point is the interaction between the elves and the dwarves. I find this the most compelling plot line. Galadriel being, unfortunately, as I said, having been reduced to a sort of Marvel superhero, and basically a Xena warrior princess all thrown into one, and has no wisdom or particular goodness, but is just simply motivated by revenge. Again, hardly a fitting way of portraying one of Tolkien's great characters, but that's what we have at this point. Furthermore, there's this figure that could be conceived to be Sauron, Adar, this darkish elf. Adar in Sindar, one of the elven languages, meaning father, revered by the orcs. Again, I think this is unlikely. I think he is moving towards, in accordance with the signs, just like these three white cloaked cultists being drawn by the presence of Sauron to some purpose that they know not what it is at this stage. But he says that the sun will soon be gone, by which I assume he's meaning not that the sun will actually be erased, but rather some sort of eruption will take place to cover the skies so that the orcs can raid and do so in the light of day, because the light will no longer be there a part of the day. So again, the sign of the extent of evil connected with light and darkness. But this leads me, I'm not going to comment much on what's happening in Numenor. I found it, again, a little bit trite and silly, and not particularly worthy of the Numenorians. Political intrigue going on there again, a means by which one of the three sailors is raised to lieutenant. He manages to catch Galadriel with the blade so that he cuts her cloak. Okay, and then gives his friend Isildur 2 punches to rehabilitate their friendship. Well and good, but again, we don't have a particularly admirable portrait of the Numenorians, who are alleged to be the best of men. We have a bunch of buffoons being led by a female elf who is indomitable, but otherwise also lacking in real goodness. What I specifically want to talk about, what I think I can add here, is in the reveal about good and evil that we have here, which deviates from Tolkien's lore. And it is in the story of the songs of the Roots of Hithaeglir. Sorry, I had to do that 3 times, which is one of the words for the Misty Mountains. Now, the Roots of Hithaeglir, I can't even say it, is this tree, and there's a legend related to this tree. The origins of the tree, which Elrond is called upon by Gil-galad, the High King Gil-galad, to recount, are that there was once an elf so pure that he reminded others of Manwë himself. And this elf put his light, or rather hid a cimmeril within the being of the tree, and to protect it put also forth his own light into the tree. Now, thus invested the tree with the light of the Silmaril, but also the light of the Creator himself. And on the other hand, on the other side, a Balrog appeared. A Balrog being like Gandalf, like Sauron, one of the supernatural beings, but in the case of the Balrog, perverted by Morgoth and bent on evil. And the Balrog sought to poison the tree and to destroy it. And at this point, a bolt of lightning came and struck this tree, which was basically this representation of both good and evil vying forth in a symbol way that seems a lot like the Tao to me. in Eastern religion, not in Tolkien's or Lewis's sense of the moral human nature that we see in common grace or in natural law, but rather just simply the yin and the yang, the good and the evil represented there. Well, when the lightning struck the tree, then it drove the goodness of the elf down into the depths of the earth, and it expressed itself forth in mithril, which then had the combination, and I quote here, a power as pure and light as good, and strong and unyielding as evil. So this is a new myth that is arisen here, which seems rather clever and seems rather spiritual. However, is all spirituality and are all accounts of good and evil compatible with Tolkien's account of good and evil? That is the question. And whether good and evil there can be materialized in such a fashion and to be seen as, and this is how it is portrayed here in the Rings of Power, as a form of salvation, whereby the mithril can saturate every elf with the light of the Valar, thereby preventing them from decaying and fading away and having to leave Middle-earth altogether, and thereby bringing down the destruction of the entire races of Middle-earth. That is the question. Can we see it in material forms? Seems to me what's going on here is very much like what we saw in episode 1 of Star Wars, where we found that the source of the Force was the midichlorian, this bizarre fetish of materialists to fail to account for supernatural good and supernatural evil, and having to explain it in biochemical forms. That's what we have here. This is vulgar to my mind. It also contradicts Tolkien's clear portrait of what evil entails, which seems to me to oppose this very explanation that we have presented to us, at least in the form of as the Rings of Power tells us. So let me say a little bit about this. What are the alternatives? Well, let me go back to a figure by the name of Augustine. Augustine also had to struggle with good and evil, and early in his days he had a very similar sort of view to the one we have presented here. There are two forces at work in the world, titanic forces, one good, the other evil, human beings merely being pawns in the grand scheme. This was the view upheld by the Manichees, a sect to whom Augustine belonged when he was young. And it's attractive because it does away with the idea of responsibility and guilt, because it just simply sets it as the things that are outside of us but not a part of us. And in general, it identifies the good as the spiritual and evil as the material, and therefore regards the body as evil, the soul as good. And of course, psychologically, it's very appealing because it gets people off the hook for their deeds, because if their bodies are inherently evil, then there's nothing they can do to prevent that. It just happens. Well, what does Augustine do with this? Well, as he thinks about it, he comes to various different conjectures about the nature of evil and how it arises. And Augustine's explanation is that it arises because human beings choose it. And he sees this as the account back in Genesis. Adam and Eve choose to eat of the forbidden fruit. And yet, in spite of that, God does not withdraw his goodness and mercy to them. He does not blight them for their choice to the point of extinction, but he does what he says he will do, and he condemns them to die. But thirdly, an aspect of this, although this choice which they made is rooted in their choice to choose a lesser good instead of the greater good, God nonetheless gave them a good gift by giving them human freedom. So he's talking about this, but he's also talking about what is the nature of evil. As Augustine describes it, evil is not something in and of itself, so it cannot be seen as is portrayed here in Rings of Power. It is not, how's it put? It is strong and unyielding. It has no such thing. It has no such goodness. It's rather the privation of good, the absence of good. That's what evil is. And if you think of how Tolkien himself presents it, rather than how it's presented in this new mythology, which seems to me to be a sort of satanic inversion of Tolkien's vision, Tolkien portrays evil in terms of shadow, as something that you only know by virtue of something that exists. And so the Nine Riders are presented as shadowy. And likewise, if you read The Lord of the Rings as opposed to watch the filmed version of it, the encounters with evil are decidedly underwhelming. The battles are not taking place over hours and hours, and we see good forces and evil forces opposed to one another in a cataclysmic, but really quite earthly form of conflict, but rather in terms that are more amenable to Augustine's portrait of evil. So once again, evil is an absence of good, a privation of the good, something like a parasite on the good. It doesn't exist apart from the greater existence of the good, and that's consonant with Tolkien's presentation of good, which comes about again when Ero Ilúvatar sings creation into existence, and Melkor decides to sing a note of discord, dissonance, and undoes what is there. And yet it does not exist without having existence himself and without hearing the original song from which he deviates. So it's a distortion, it's a lesser version, it's a lesser good. That seems to me to be contradicted in this little mythological account here, which no doubt it's the directors and authors of Rings of Power thought was very clever, but it seems to me is going to result in a terrible distortion of Tolkien's essential portrait of good and evil. And the idea that Mithril will stop the decay of the sacred tree, we're getting into the realm of magic now. And so for me, this is greatly disturbing at the metaphysical level, at the level that would have bothered Tolkien enormously. And so when Tar Palantir later on asks his daughter Miriel not to go into the battle and can see nothing but evil and only darkness awaiting, we take that seriously in the sense that he is seen as far-sighted, like his name, Tar Palantir. He can see into the future, into the distance, and he only sees darkness. Does this make him a sort of Denethor figure? I don't think so. But still, it suggests a presence of evil that is, it seems to me, wholly at odds from the way the good and evil are portrayed in Tolkien's own work. I could say more about this episode. There's a lot in it, but that's the essential. That's what I wanted to focus on. I hope you found it helpful. If you like what I've said, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I shall see you next week.